Sociology from the University of Pittsburgh. She's worked in Pittsburgh's community as a community mental health system, I guess was what I had intended to say, has worked in Pittsburgh's community health system as a mental health professional and as an advocate. She was a student in the university's Bioethics program, a program most of you know I now direct, and has also twice taught the medical humanities and social sciences seminar that accompanies our clinical practicum. Linda taught sociology at Oakland University in Michigan for 6 years before coming back to Pittsburgh to join the faculty of sociology and public policy at Duquesne University in the fall of 2007. There she teaches courses in sociological methods, human services, and field work. Here at Pitt, she's an affiliated faculty member at the Center for Bioethics and Health Law. Her book, Talking Back to Psychiatry, the Consumer Survivor Ex-Patient Movement, describes her research with activists who work for human rights, voice, and choice in psychiatric treatment. It was published by Routledge in 2005. Her articles published in Humanities and Society and in Radical Psychology focus on the intersection of professionals who construct health policy and provide social services with those who are the objects of such policy and the recipients of such services. Today, Linda will discuss a related intersection, the intersection of medical sociology and bioethics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Morrison.
Hi. I thought of this topic because actually Lisa sent me an email saying, would you do a grand rounds? And how can I do a grand rounds? What will I talk about? And then I had just finished teaching that seminar this summer, and I realized that there were a lot of issues that came up during that seminar that made me think about sociology, bioethics, especially with medical humanities, which is supposed to be the place where these things come together, and it seemed like there was some big gaps there, and it made me uncomfortable. So I thought this would be a good chance to explore some of these things. Excuse me. The funny thing is, as I explored more and more, I realized that this is huge. And what I'm doing today is just sort of a very basic, let's see how these can link up. Maybe another time I'll do some kind of review of the amazing things that have been done in terms of research into bioethics and practice, and how they have interrelated in another way. But today I'm going to keep it pretty simple. And another thing I want to say is I'm not here to blame or attack or anything like that. It would be, some sociologists have done that in the past, which I may mention. But I'd like to be a little playful with this stuff today and invite you to think about how these intersections can work, not only with sociology of medicine, but also some of you I know are in law, some may be in philosophy. I know there's some communication people here. So actually I think that sociology is useful in a number of ways. I'll tell you about how I got involved in this thinking. When I was supposed to teach the course this summer, I went onto the web and I thought, well, what the heck is medical humanities anyway? Okay, because I sort of had an idea, but I wasn't sure how people addressed it. So New York University is pretty well known in this area, and they have a big website that they've created with lots of databases and other things. And here they are. This was the first thing that troubled me. We define the term medical humanities broadly to include an interdisciplinary field of humanities, literature, philosophy, ethics, history, and religion, social science, anthropology, cultural studies, psychology, and sociology, and the arts. Okay? And their application to medical education and practice. This is very lumped together. This is really absorbing everything under this one label of medical humanities. There's actually another couple of paragraphs I wanted to share with you. Here's how they divide it up under this term humanities. Humanities and arts provide insight into the human condition, suffering, personhood, responsibility to each each other and the historical perspective on medical practice. Attention to literature and the arts helps develop and nurture skills of observation, analysis, empathy, and self-reflection, essential for humane medical care. So we want to teach medical humanities and medical training to try to help people be more humane, have empathy, things like that. And certainly we want to introduce that to bioethics as well. Now here's where they put social sciences, which I think is so interesting. Social sciences help us to understand, one, how bioscience and medicine take place within cultural and social contexts. That is important to recognize and understand. How culture interacts with the individual experience of illness, and the way medicine is practiced. Culture is also interacting with that. But I would submit that a lot of the stuff in the previous paragraph can also be included in social science, and a lot more critical thinking, which I think is essential for people who are learning about the medical system and bioethics' place in it. And especially if your place is as a bioethicist, what's your role in this game? Okay, so that's sort of what got me troubled in the first place. And I thought, how can I make sure that social science gets its place in the conversation? Now, how many of you have had a sociology course in your training? Ooh, a few people. This is very good. Some of this will be a review. I'm actually going to talk about some of the concepts. And when I teach this to my undergraduates, I'm always telling them how these concepts are really useful because they're good tools for seeing the world. Okay, we teach them because they are useful. They matter because they are useful. We never just learn them for the sake of learning them, which I think happens a lot. So the idea of the sociological imagination came from the sociologist C. Wright Mills, and it's really very important for people seeing themselves within our relationship to the larger society. Okay, sort of historical biography, where did I come from? But it's not just me, it's me in the social system. Okay, very important to be able to think of yourself as a part of something bigger. And especially, he emphasized the idea of people moving from an awareness of their personal problems to seeing them in terms of public issues. Okay, so maybe you're ill and you feel like it's just you, or maybe you've lost your job, or you're going through a divorce or something, and this feels like your personal problem. When enough people start to think about the larger system, and they realize there are lots of people in this position, okay, people who are in the hospital, people who can't get medical care, it's not just them. This becomes a public issue. And this kind of awareness can move people to a very different stance and hopefully move them also to action. Okay, so this is the sociological imagination, or the sociological perspective, where you start to see things as they are interrelated. Nothing is separate. The medical system is not separate from the other systems that we encounter in our lives in the social worlds. So when we're thinking about the work of sociology, one of the most important things that we can gain from sociology is the idea of social relations and insights into social relations. For sociology, everything is relational. Okay, there is no such thing as an individual person. The smallest group is two people. Okay, and we're always operating in relation to somebody else, which I'll mention when I talk about social roles. Sociology, as I mentioned, gives us insights into the systems at work, including, for today, especially the medical system, the legal system. Sociology has done a lot of research about professionalization and the role of professions in society, what makes a profession special. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Always, again, the historical developments are really important. How did we get here? You have to be able to look into the past to understand the future. One thing that's really fun about sociology of professions is to look at the turf wars, even looking at what's happening today in relation to physical therapists, in relation to pharmacists who are now getting higher professional degrees, more advanced, whatever. where they actually can spar with the medical profession at an equal level, and what kind of changes are going to be happening because of that. Definitely sociology is great at creating the opportunity for empirical observation. Go and hang out. First of all, the idea of participant observation or ethnography has been really big in medical sociology, and I'll mention some of those studies. And then other kinds of research, more quantitative research is also possible. And then another one that I really think is important is the critiques of the taken for granted. Sociology really helps us to challenge the taken for granted. One of the goals in this summer seminar in the practicum for students who were in the practicum, and as it turned out, only a couple of the students were in the practicum. So they had a lot of different kinds of professional experiences, training experiences, so that they were being asked to look at whatever they had to grapple with as we looked at these ideas of how to see things in a way that they can surprise you. One of the ways the syllabus had been written, even before I started teaching this course, was look for the things that surprise you in your clinical practicum. And those are the really important ones. They stand out, they make you think. But the danger is that if you're already going along and accepting the taken for granted, which most of us will do because of our roles in society, we don't notice the things that surprise us. So the idea is to hone this observation approach so that you do notice the things that are maybe, if not surprising, ought to be surprising. How do you question the taken for granted? Okay, so let's see. I already mentioned everything is relational. So in sociology, we want to know what organizes social relations. What can you look at? And there are certain sociological concepts, again, that I'll just mention to you because they're very important tools. And we did talk about these in the seminar this summer. Sometimes we were just discussing the readings from different people's point of view. It was a very good discussion group. And then sometimes I felt really bad that I had to interject and say, okay, now I'm going to get didactic here. I'm going to teach you some sociology. And I was always a little apologetic about that. But then as time went on, I realized that they didn't have these tools and that it was helping the students and even me at the same time to see things more clearly as we were reading these narratives, which I'll mention a little bit. Okay, so status. The everyday word of status, usually makes you think of a Mercedes or something like that. But every single thing that we are in society, every position that we hold, every attribute really has to do with a status. If you're a mother or a daughter, or if you're a male or a female, these are status positions that exist in society. And every status also has a role, at least one role, which is the expected behaviors for that position. Okay, so you can think just briefly about all of the different statuses you hold. Many of you are professionals and students at the same time. You might be parents, you might be teaching. For me, it's always been very complicated because there are always contradictory roles. And really, sometimes this idea of role conflict comes into play, where the things that are expected of you for one of your statuses gets in the way of what you're supposed to be able to do for another one. And these are things that we also can observe in others. We can start thinking about it in terms of ourselves, but the goal here is to be able to look at the medical system, look at the legal system and how they intersect, and see, well, who are these people that I'm watching? What are their status and roles, and how are they actually conflicting and competing with each other? So we have role conflict. Does anybody know what role strain is? This is something that most people don't know much about. And I think you run into this a lot, even as a budding bioethicist or lawyer or whatever. When you don't quite have the skills and the knowledge developed to perform your role comfortably, it's really hard. And you can see people who are just new doctors who are trying to perform their functions properly, but they really have no clue. They're so afraid. of making a mistake, things like that. So a lot of times our roles are so challenging for us, we can't let other people know because this is our status now, we're supposed to be able to do something. So these are really interesting concepts for observation, and to see, well, what's going on under the surface. One of the things about ethnography is that you can see not just what people say they do or think they do, but what they really do, and what they really talk about among themselves or with other people, how they present themselves, and then what's really going on under the surface. So medical sociology has been really useful because you can hang out and get to know what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, I don't know if anybody, I haven't been able to find anybody who did a really good ethnography of training in bioethics. That would be interesting, because in bioethics people are coming from so many different backgrounds, and how do you become socialized into that new role? Here's another concept that's very important, the idea of norms, okay, and normativity, which I think that most people probably know something about. But it's important to reflect on it. What is understood to be desirable or acceptable within a society or a setting? What's normative? What are the norms? The most dangerous thing about norms is that there are lots of different norms, and whose norms are the norm? Who decides? Who has the power to define the norm for other people's behavior? This is where you get into issues of diversity and conflict and power relations, which sociology is really interested in. There are so many different groups and different cultures, especially compared to, say, the 50s, when people first started looking at these questions in medical education and things like that. Things were really, I don't know even how to describe it. There were obviously other kinds of people, but most people who were in these statuses and roles really hardly saw them unless they would see them as patients or something. There was a lot less intermingling of different groups, at least in some senses. So now we're faced with so many different kinds of norms, and people have to try to negotiate in much more complex ways. And that also affects bioethics and ethical questions. Okay, and then the idea of deviance comes into this notion. If you're not meeting the expectations of the norms, then you are definitely considered to be deviant, and we'll see what happens in that case, okay? Especially matters in the research that I have done. If you are considered to be deviant, partly because of an illness or some other kind of behavioral differences or appearance differences, or however you can be different, often the expectation is that you will adjust to the norms of the larger group or the larger society, and that always doesn't happen. So if you then are considered to be a deviant, if you aren't taking the medicine that you're supposed to take, or you're not changing your behavior the way you're supposed to, that can lead to even more efforts at social control. So this is not just police work here. We're talking about medicine. And, well, let's go back here. Like I said, the expected norms in one subculture are seen as deviant in another group. You can be a deviant if you're a member of a gang, but you decide you want to go to school, and go to the library after school, and then your buddies in the gang think that you're deviant. You're not going along with those norms. The same thing in any kind of subgroup. If you're a doctor and you don't feel confident about your work, or you haven't been trained in a way that makes you feel like other doctors or act like other doctors, take on that role, then you can be seen as deviant, and you can be certainly picked on a lot. So all of these issues of prejudice and discrimination, stigma, are all related to failure to meet the norm expectations. And this also applies to being a patient or whatever. I hope this isn't too simple. I just wanted to review these ideas. And then the idea of social control. We've all had that experience. Sometimes people just tell us what to do. Sometimes people pull us off for speeding. Other times our friends will look at us and say, "You're going to wear that?" Something all forms of social control. And certainly you see it in the hospital. Certainly you see it in the clinic, where certain norms are very powerful and people are expected to go along with them. Why do people not comply with their medication? Why do people leave the hospital against medical advice? What's going on here? How do we decide what's okay and what's not okay? So this is all related to sociology as well. There are two forms of sociology in relating to medicine. I think it's good to differentiate them a little bit. The sociology of health and illness is really about the patient, okay? And what's the patient's experience of illness, or someone who's not even yet a patient? Because illness itself, oops, I missed a letter, is a form of deviance. It's a deviance from the norm. We want to be healthy, okay? The norm is to be healthy, and if we are ill, then we are expected to try to get better, or expected to want to get better at least, because health is the normative state. And what's really funny is that lots of people, even if you ask them, sociologists have asked people, well, are you healthy? And nobody's really sure what healthy means. They'll say, well, yeah, I guess I'm healthy, but I think I need to exercise more, or this kind of thing. Even if they're already in good health, they'll feel like they should be normatively working towards better health. So there are these kinds of stresses on people and ideas about what health is. So if sickness is deviance, a movement away from the norm, we do want to be better, but it isn't always possible. So what do we do then? I'm going to talk to you about the sick role and the idea of secondary gain. Sometimes if we are ill, then we get a lot of extra attention. Good things can happen to us. The functionalist sociologists back in the 50s who invented this idea of the sick role and the doctor role were very concerned about role theory and how people who were allowed to continue to be deviant were very disruptive to the society, the smooth functioning of society. So we had to try to fix them. And I certainly think that we can still see that, just another way of looking at things. Socialization itself is all about learning the roles. It's not hanging out with your friends, as I always tell my undergrads, but it's really becoming little members of society. How do we learn what's expected of us? Also through some methods of social control when we deviate from them. What a lot of people don't know anything about is the idea of re-socialization. Once you've been socialized as a child into the world around you and what's expected in this social world, sometimes we have to change what we've already learned. And sometimes that means unlearning some of the things. Even just when you begin school, you have to learn to be different than you were when you were just playing. If you go to medical school, when you come to college, when you go to law school, these are really serious re-socialization moments where you have to become something different. What's considered to be normal when you're growing up or as an ordinary person is all of a sudden not normal anymore, and you have to change. In your professional socialization and your professional training, there's another slide about this also. Basically, some of the major areas where this has been studied is in medicine and in the law, military service, and in the clergy, and then also in total institutions like prisons, mental hospitals, things like that, where the rules are different from the outside world. And certainly in medical training, the same thing is true. Degradation ceremonies are very powerful moments when you are ridiculed, where your old wisdoms, the smart things that you have known all your life are not okay anymore. So they really pick on you and ridicule you and make you feel horrible until you stop believing the same things and acting those ways, and then you start rebuilding your identity in the new frame of this re-socialization. Everybody who's been in law school has this experience of embarrassment and how hard you have to work, and same thing in medical training and having to be publicly humiliated. This is all to train you to be thinking differently, seeing the world differently, and that's really important to think about. Now, Talcott Parsons, this is way back, like I said, from the 50s. We talked about this a good bit in my seminar and it turned out to be very useful. All of these roles have rights and responsibilities, and they also can be considered in the framework of an ideal type, where nobody can say that this is exactly true for everyone. We use ideal types in sociology to create a sort of model against which to push things and see, well, how do they compare? This is a way of looking, and then we can see the differences and try to understand, well, what's going on here. The sick role, remember I talked about the dangers of deviance. The first right is the right to be excused from your normal role obligations. Okay? If you're ill, then if you're, say you're a mother who's ill, then you don't have to take time off from caring for your children or something like that, and you don't have to feel too guilty about it. Your other roles are set aside, and you're forgiven, because it's not your fault, which is sort of the second right. The right to be excused from blame for your incapacitation or your illness. Now, we have a lot of instances where this is not the case, especially in terms of transplants and things like that. Whose fault is it that this happened to you? You know, we are going to hold it against you, whatever. But this is the ideal model. If you are excused and you're not blamed, then you have also these two responsibilities. Otherwise, you're still being deviant. You have to seek out appropriate expert assistance. You have to go to the doctor. Okay? If you don't go to the doctor, then you're continuing in your sick role when you should be going for help. Okay, so that makes people wonder, well, why are you doing that? Too much secondary gain, you're getting too much time off, whatever. So this kind of situation is at work. And then you also have the responsibility to follow through with that expert's advice. Okay, so this is putting the patient in a really interesting place. And again, this is from the 50s, where when doctors were king, and they were all mostly men, they certainly were kings. And the idea of their authority, their expert authority, that you had to follow through. Otherwise, you weren't engaging properly with the sick role. And so you wouldn't get better, and you wouldn't lose your deviant status. So what's almost more interesting is the doctor role that goes along with this. Okay. Some of the rights that physicians have, and other medical professionals as well, the right to intrude on the individual's bodily space. This is a really big change, okay, from your ordinary behavior and your ordinary role. Most of the time, this would be considered, what doctors do, would be considered assault, okay? But if you have this special status, and you have these special roles to follow through on, you actually have to learn how to do that. How do you intubate somebody? And you have to practice and practice and practice and hurt people, and then, this is part of your job. So if you have the right, you also have the responsibility to do that. You also have the right to expect the patient to comply, or now we have the more politically correct word of adherence, to adhere to your treatment plan and the things that you suggest. So this gives the doctor a lot of power in their relationship. And these are supposed to be sort of tied together. But on the other side, and this is almost like a fiduciary responsibility, you're supposed to put the sick person's interests ahead of other things. This is supposed to be the most important consideration. And you also have the responsibility to use your professional expertise to the greatest extent possible to try to cure this person. So it's a huge responsibility. And this is sort of the professional role. Put your personal roles aside and follow through. We do have expectations of physicians that are almost superhuman. We expect them to be able to do these things and to want to, and to put everything else aside for the sake of the patient. Okay, so then we can think of moving from deviance to the norm and treatment as a form of social control. Okay, because if this is done correctly, then people will return to their appropriate role functionings, the social order will be maintained again and restored, and then this dysfunctional member will no longer be dysfunctional. So you can see how this role theory is really based on a functionality model of society, which we don't really use as much today, but it's very useful to see how we form these expectations of how people should be responding in these social situations. It's a little bit old-fashioned, but it's also very effective. And the other thing that it shows us is that this relationship of the doctor and patient is very strongly asymmetrical. You know, who has the power to decide? Who has the power to make things happen? One person is the producer of care, and the other person is there because of a desire for treatment, most of the time, unless they're there against their will, which is another situation entirely. So supposedly there is a little bit of power and symmetry in the power making this transaction possible in the first place. Okay, so these are some basic concepts in medical social. They sort of fit in relation to the acute illness. Okay, most of us know that there's all sorts of reasons that people are being treated or being in the hospital because their illness doesn't go away, and that changes the relationship quite a bit. Chronic illness is very different. Another thing that we think about in sociology is that a person can be sick without being ill. Okay, so we have this idea that the sickness is the physical disease, and illness is the personal experience of this diseased state. Sometimes an illness isn't even recognized as a disease. People can feel ill, you know, chronic fatigue syndrome, things like that. We have the ideas of medicalization and then demedicalization when things are decided not to be an illness anymore. The experience of your body, the experience of yourself in relation to the body is very important in this sort of sociology of health and illness. Okay, and this definitely affects the social role and your experience of the self, and narratives are a very powerful source of this kind of understanding. So let's see, where are we going here? Oh yeah. The idea of medical sociology as sociology in medicine is taking all of this knowledge and these points of view about these roles and what's going on, and then doing sociological research in the service of medicine, to make medicine work better, okay, to make it more successful in treating the patients. How do we assist in helping the doctors and other medical caretakers to understand the social experience better, to be able to influence people more successfully, all of this kind of thing. Anthropology as social science has also been used extensively in this area. Let's understand this culture has a different meaning of illness, a different cosmology of illness. So if you want these people to comply with your treatment, then you have to understand how they see the body, how they see a fever, how they see whatever, and you have to adjust to their cultural views in order to treat them. Understanding the factors in health and illness that are social factors. There's a whole history of medical sociology that's just recently been published. It's very enlightening, talking about how medicine invited sociology to start to work with, you know, like the early days of social medicine at Harvard and different things like that. These kinds of bonds have been threatened and strengthened through the history of sociology and medicine. That history is very interesting. The idea of sociology as a source of progressive reform, which was a more radical position, and then just the idea of being more scientific and developing more knowledge in order to serve medical practice. Okay. These three different roles, being a scientist of behavior, to help medicine to work better, to be collaborating in teaching, especially in the medical schools, but also teaching sociology. And then the idea of policy analysis is another role for sociologists. And one of the reasons I'm going through all this is because I believe that sociology and bioethics could also benefit from these two different kinds of relationships, because there's so much that's possible in terms of learning more about what's actually happening, learning more about the relationships, learning more about the practice of bioethics and training of bioethics within the social context. And as a parallel to medical sociology, it seems pretty possible. The thing that troubles bioethics the most, is, at least historically, and some of this work, the most provocative work was done in the 90s, when they decided that bioethics was irrelevant, and the decision-making in medicine was actually happening not just by the doctors, but throughout, especially with nurses and other people who were in the caregiving roles. The medical decision-making was not being made in the principles way that people were thinking that it was, but it was more pragmatic and on the ground. So there was a real challenge to bioethics in the 90s by sociology. And this is where we're looking at sociology of medicine, or sociology of bioethics, where we're studying this field and seeing, well, how do they do these things? And why do they do what they do? What are they really doing? What do they think they're doing? How can they perhaps do things differently if they try to see what it is that's happening within their own social structure? Because all of our activities are structured and constrained in different ways. But again, unless you get this perspective where you can see things, you can be surprised by things, and stop taking them for granted, then we just go about our business according to the structures and the statuses and roles that already exist. So this is a way of challenging, again, this taken for granted situation. So before, medical training was a huge object of study by medical sociologists. Even the whole idea of cadaver lab as being a special rite of passage that people go through that makes them feel different from anybody else. People, it's like Renee Fox and other folks were hanging out with the students all the time, riding with them on the elevator and thinking, oh, this is so great. We just came from this room and we're so different from ordinary people. This makes us really special. And this idea of creating a special category of experience that sets you apart in medical training and also medical practice. So people who are studying about that and actually, observing and seeing how people treat each other and how this all works is a really valuable insight, creates insights that are very valuable. But it's also critiquing the existing taken for granted, and it makes people very uncomfortable sometimes. So there has to be a balance there. And looking at inequalities, that's what sociologists are practically best at, trying to understand both within the system, outside the system, and in relation to the parts of the system. I think it's interesting to think about bioethicists. What is their position in the hospital? Some bioethicists I've heard are treated with a great deal of respect, and in other situations they're sort of there in the room, nobody really wants to listen to them, and oh, well, why are we doing this anyway? And so to be able to look at these kinds of questions also in relation to the larger system, it may be that some people already are looking at it, but sociologists are, I think, uniquely situated to be able to do that. And often, as I mentioned before, with participant observation studies over a long period of time where you can see how people are responding to each other, how they do what they do, and it's not necessarily what they think that they do or what they say that they do. The sense of professional status is also a good topic for bioethics because the idea of credentialing bioethics keeps coming and going, and what are we going to do with that, and why do we want to do that? So the idea of professional status has also been sort of defined, and this originally came out of the Abraham Flexner study of making medicine into a professional status back earlier in the century. So the way they describe this is in different parts. A distinct and specialized body of knowledge. A lot of times if an occupation wants to become a profession, to have this special status, there is an issue about whether they create their own distinct research and their own knowledge base, or if they use somebody else's. I know social work for a while was struggling with that because they really used, medical, psychological, other kinds of nursing or other kinds of knowledge, and they didn't do their own research. And then they started to put a big push on doing their own research, and eventually they did get more professional status and licensing, things like that. But these are some of the factors. How do you decide? Plumbing is an occupation and doctoring is a profession. What are the special things? And this is what they've arrived at. Not many people are aware of these factors. The idea of a long period of specialized training, within which, of course, you see these re-socialization processes are going on. The process of professionalization, where you changed from an ordinary person into this special professional person. And also the autonomy of professions, where they have control over their determination of what training standards will be and what credentialing standards will be. They can make them up, and then they tell the state, this is what we do. And the state says, okay, I'm going to give you a license, and you can test each other. They make the decisions about that. It's a very powerful position to be in. The idea that there is a code of ethics, very important to any profession. And the assumption there, too, is that there's a service orientation. People are not supposed to be in it for great gain. They're supposed to be there for better reasons that can be admired. And then this autonomy, again, in practice and even in self-policing. Who gets to police your professional members? Probably members themselves. So here, coming back to sociology and bioethics, I think that we can support bioethics efforts by using empirical research. That's one way of sociology for bioethics, or sociology in bioethics. We can also shed light on the bioethical practices and training process. We can critique the assumptions that are being made within the whole process of consultation and other aspects. There's so many different aspects that can be looked at. Help people to see how these social structures are influencing their work, and how cultural settings and social interaction, things again that we take for granted, but the sociologists drive each other crazy and drive themselves crazy seeing all the time. I can't not see these things. And even when I was doing my practicum, I remember seeing, it was almost 10 years ago now, and one day there was a young woman who was doubled over in pain from sickle cell. She claimed sickle cell, and there were these young white residents who were calling her a drug seeker and brushing her off and leaving her alone for long periods of time. And then later that day they went to see a white suburban high school teacher who needed a liver transplant. And sure, maybe he drank a little bit, but he was more, like them. He was an admirable guy, and they had a lot of respect for this guy. There were all of these things that I was seeing when I was in my practicum that just reeked of class, gender, race, and other kinds of issues of inequality. I don't know if other people see that, but that's another thing I tell my students is that sometimes sociologists, just dream sociology. Everything that you see is going to be seen in a different way than other people. So what we really like to do is try to influence other people to see the world more like we do, because we tend to think that it's really a valuable disease that we have. So anyway, you can see these other kinds of things. How social context influences the questions of what is a bioethics problem anyway, and what is the response. I had a terrible time with this. It may be one of the reasons that I never finished the program. I never did my thesis. The things that I was most interested in had to do with psychiatry, and there were opinions that all the problems in psychiatry have been solved. There are no ethical problems in psychiatry. In terms of informed consent, in terms of treatment, some of the psychiatry observations that I did during my practicum are still also in my mind. One in particular, on the inpatient ward, there was a young man who was there for depression, and he was getting a medication change, who was very well informed, one of the sort of self-advocates that I've been studying in my sociological research. And so he said to the doctor, well, can you tell me what I can expect from this new medication? You know, what's it going to be like? And the doctor just said, oh, well, we'll just wait and see. You know, and we left the room, and I had to follow the doctor out of the room. So later on I said, hey, doctor, how come you didn't tell this guy? He asked you a pretty good question. How come you decided not to inform him about what he could expect from the medication? Certainly there was no informed consent about side effects or anything like that, which there rarely is in psychiatry. And what I was told was, well, if we tell him what all the side effects are going to be, then he won't take the medicine. And then where will we be? We'll have to take him to, you know, a judge and get him treated against his will, which, you know, is a very ethical issue, I think, and ongoing in a lot of situations. So that's another form of inequality. There are so many examples of that. Anyway, I think that that kind of awareness can be very useful, and that's why I put down this whole idea of maybe a consultative role. How can we as sociologists help bioethicists to increase their awareness of these social issues, or even of bioethicists' status and situation, position, whatever you want to say, within the larger system of medicine and the law. It's much more of a pragmatic approach, a social justice approach. Informed consent issues are really crucial, I think, in so many ways. And again, when I was being trained in research ethics, it was very hard for me to see so many researchers who were abiding, whatever that word is, abiding by the principles, adhering to the principles, but not seeing the meaning of the principles. Why are they important for the human beings? Okay, let's just make sure I go through this process and everything will be okay, and then I can, you know, have access to my subjects, my human subjects. So when I teach research methods now and I talk about ethics, I always ask my students, do we as human beings exist as raw material for the, you know, the medical research machine, or whatever you want to call it? When I've talked with people about therapeutic misconception, even, which was one of our favorite conversations sometimes, it really troubled me that there was sometimes a sort of dismissal of the people who were involved. Well, we don't really care if you really understand. Again, we wouldn't be able to get any research subjects if we were so careful to explain all of the different things that could be done. There was one discussion of a man who was told about the arms of the study, you know, and his information, and people were laughing at a description, you know, a transcription of his words, where he was asked, well, what's happening to you in the study? And he said, well, I know that if I'm in one part of the study, then I get the medicine in this arm, and if I'm in the other part, I get the medicine in this other arm. People thought that was hysterical. And so me, of course, being myself, I just sort of said, doesn't that trouble you that he's gotten this basic misunderstanding? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that he understands? Maybe we could try a little harder. And so my sociological impulses, or insights, or inputs, there are all these different words I could use, sometimes got me in trouble and made it hard for me to really get it. As much as I tried hard to become, you know, a good philosopher, a good bioethics person, to be able to think abstractly and keep myself out of the messy, dirty parts, you know, of real life, then, you know, at that time especially, I wasn't able to do that. So I would like to find a way to join those things together so that both parties could benefit from a relationship that would benefit, obviously, patients and research subjects and anyone else who was involved in the, you know, the process. So, let's skip that part. At the very end, I think this is my last slide. Yes, it is. I may have already mentioned these things, but how are the tasks of bioethics constrained by disciplinary habits, these are great words, professional relationships, cultural ways of seeing. Who are the people going into bioethics, and what are their cultural constraints and their views? How can we overcome these ways of seeing? How are we constrained by the institutional needs and the economic demands, the power and prestige arrangements? Maybe we need to think really hard about what are the concerns and the goals of bioethics. And this question of whether bioethics should become a profession and what that would do to the whole process of learning and working in practice in the medical system. Anyway, those are some of the things I was thinking about, and I wanted to share them with you. I guess we have a little bit of time if people have questions or concerns or any kinds of comments. Feel free.
Well, question that I have, or maybe a challenge, would be that it would seem to me that one couldn't be a good bioethicist and not even a good philosopher of certain sorts of philosophy, maybe not physics or whatever, but so ethicist, if one didn't have some of these either sociological impulses or the awareness of the kinds of interactions, inequalities, norms, deviations from norms that you point out. Now maybe everything there is packed into what it means to be a good one, a good bioethicist, a good philosopher ethicist. But I guess I'm just challenging that there is either a necessary or even an existing in practice sort of conflict in those. Maybe to be John Stuart Mill, the modern day John Stuart Mill, to take an example of a philosopher ethicist, you somehow need to be able to abstract. But still, it would seem that that he, and he's right, was looking at these, aware of these social roles, patterns of action, some might be, some forms of deviation lead to a lack of utility. Some forms of adhering to certain norms will tend to the greatest good for the greatest number. It seems that there's a real blending, even at that sort of abstract level of sociological insights or awareness, and then the argument for what's right and wrong based on that, or what the ethical import is.
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think of a good way to respond. I think that being aware of all of these different factors and then moving towards a decision about what's the greatest good for the greatest number in an abstract sense is almost a contradictory situation. It's like, well, I'll decide. I know all these things exist out there, but I'm the philosopher. I'm the ethicist. I'm the smart guy, and so I'm going to make this decision no matter what this person's situation is or whatever. That's my first response. Is that it's so contradictory, and I would hope that it could maintain its contradictoriness and have a tension, without people feeling like, oh, okay, well, I know that this is the right thing. It's like, this is so hard to decide what the right thing is. How do we come to this agreement? Let's try to get some other opinions. Let's try to get some other points of view. That's just my response. Yes?
What are the trends between academic medical laboratories and pharmaceutical companies?
What are the trends? I think they're all trying to get money, and they're all trying to keep their research projects going. I read recently, I don't know if this touches your question or not, but I forget if it was Lilly or some other pharmaceutical company is shifting its focus on the things that can be most quickly profitable, most quickly get findings, like for Alzheimer's and some certain things like that, rather than the long-term kind of basic science of pharmaceuticals that they've been working on. So I think that, maybe that wasn't the source of your question. Are you thinking about, are academics, researchers working for the pharmaceutical companies? Or what was your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that would include that.
Yeah.
But the sponsorship and
Mm-hmm.
the grants seem to be continually being more tied into each other.
Well, I think they are in a way, but one thing that's working against that, if I'm correct in this assumption, is that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are starting to do their own research because they don't have to be so much subjected to the constraints of the institutional review boards. So they're having private researchers doing, gathering subjects and doing a lot of the work. And that's one of the areas that there's been a lot of, exposés of people who are getting money for recruiting so many folks. And they don't have the same kinds of ethical restraints as the academic researchers would. That's one force I think that's at work. But there may be others that I don't know about. Yeah.
I know that the medicine that we practice today is not the same medicine that we practiced previously because of this incorporation of different concepts from like the medical humanities that talks about in the social sciences. But do you find that there's still this resistance to these ideas? Because it is a type of, you go into medical school, it's a different culture, different type of socialization.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that there's still a resistance to these ideas? And how do we go about changing that mentality within that?
Well, that's a good question.
Please repeat the question.
Oh, can you repeat it a little louder?
Yes. I was asking her if she found that the medical community is still resistant to the ideas that are in the social sciences and the humanities, and how do we go about changing that mentality or compromising, making it work?
I think one of the hardest things is to try to build it in as more than just, oh, here's a course that I have to take now. I know that a few years ago there was an issue to, well, how are we going to have this sort of social science course in the medical school? How are we going to get people to show up? Things like that. But I think that also some medical schools are changing their admissions procedures or their guidelines to try to include people who have a more humanistic background and not just science. So I think it's always going to be hard to try to balance the need for good scientists to get into medical school, and how are you supposed to re-socialize them into being more humanistic when they've already been socialized so strongly to be scientists. And I think that that's going to be a large effort if they really want to make sure that this happens. You're going to have to change your admissions policy, you're going to have to change your training, and that's not something, especially because of this idea of the training already exists and the professionalization. And the older doctors say, well, I did this is what's going to be. How do you actually change something that's such a powerful machine? It maybe has to start with a few programs that are really dedicated to change. And then it would catch on. I mean, I haven't been hanging around in medical schools recently, so some of you may know better than I do. But those are some of the principles behind it that I would imagine are at work.
Is there some sort of worry that
Pick up, please.
is there a worry for having physicians who are supposed to be objective when they're looking at a patient? Because everyone's going to have extraneous variables and so forth that lead to them to have a certain disease, or they may have some social constraints as to why they want to pursue a certain type of treatment. But I don't know if what you're advocating is for a physician to size up a patient when they walk through the door. And I just don't know. I understand you can be cognizant of your own choices you make when you're a physician, but how far does that play a role, and does that start to get to a point where you start to hinder your ability to look at someone objectively and just look at trying to treat the disease itself, opposed to trying to think of all of these other
big issue, the clinical distance kind of thing, where we need to be able to be evaluated based on the medical needs. And how do you include these other kinds of issues in the background? I mean, one of my suggestions was that bioethicists in particular become more aware of that in order to be able to represent those kinds of differences in a consultation or whatever. But I agree that that's one reason why doctors aren't supposed to treat their own families, different things like that. How can they keep that clinical view? But in some kinds of decisions, even especially related to autonomy, things like that, depending on the person's situation, there may be other people in the family or other people involved in the case that should also be consulted or different things like that. To just, instead of having this sort of purified relationship that's defined according to the clinical needs, maybe this, there could be a social worker, it doesn't even have to be the clinician, but somebody in the system should also be aware of some of the more social or cultural issues. Unless, you have the most acute, dangerous situation, then obviously you have to act. But doctors in training today mostly aren't going to be very good at doing those sorts of things, so maybe they wouldn't be able to balance it as well. I understand your concern. There should be a concern. And maybe it needs to be built in some other way. I'm not sure exactly how to answer your question, but it's definitely an issue. You want something to bring up?
Yeah, and maybe just to add something into that part of the conversation, when have we asked too much of a medical professional? It seems to me that one thing you mentioned which really puts strain on this question is chronic illnesses, chronic pain, where it's sort of knowledge of the sociology of the individual. Are they likely to follow through with certain treatments? What kind of a living situation do they have, et cetera, could be central to treatment decisions in that case. And so I think, and you can correct me or sort of add on to this, but it seems to me that part of dealing with this problem is figuring out in which cases those issues become relevant to treatment, when you can't really adequately treat without a knowledge of some of these elements.
Well, I think it's even, Chuck Litz has written an article years ago about the idea of moving to a chronic position where the doctor gives up actually some of that expertise, where the experiential knowledge of the patient comes into play. And there's more of a partnering between the patient and the doctor, because if they're at home, with diabetes or other things, you need the education, but you also need their knowledge of their illness. And also the doctor sort of steps back. I mean, the whole story is that doctors are less interested in chronic patients because they can't have, the successful intervention or whatever. But sometimes that's good for the patient, because then they also can bring in their social support system and, try to partner up with the doctor or a nurse or whatever to try to maintain as much health as possible. Or maybe the doctor's role to cure isn't possible anymore. There's also a sociologist, her name is Kathy Charmaz, Charmaz. She does a lot of work with narrative and chronic illness, and she has a book called Good Days, Bad Days, which is really, it was a sort of ethnography of chronic illness and how the patients themselves experience their illness and their changing health status, sort of separate from the professional views. So yeah, that's a place where you can create more distance. Any other questions? You have another question, but I'm
I have a question, I had a comment.
Oh, good.
I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with the fact that we need to move away from this, incorporating humanities and only treating the disease. Because I think the idea is that you should be treating the person who has the disease. And even in research and when you're writing grants and proposals, for instance, I can't write that the people I'm working with are diabetics. I have to say people with diabetes, which is a different concept. And I don't necessarily think that you lose anything as far as skill as a physician if you are trained to include, humanistic qualities, that they're doing, that part of life. trained in sociology or in other disciplines doesn't necessarily mean that
You're not a good doctor.
you're not good doctors or you're ineffective or impractical. Because I understand that if you're a physician, you can't necessarily step back and think, well, this person is from this SES type of position and they have a family history of X, Y, and Z. But that's a different situation. Things are more immediate, right? So in the case of like infectious disease, things are more quickly, it's chronic. And so of course there's a reality and there's a practicality that you have to incorporate, but I don't think you lose anything from having that type of training.
I tend to agree with you. I think it depends on the training that people have, and if they learn to do those things together. But I think it also depends on the structure of care. Like how much time do you have to spend with this patient?
Yeah.
And then maybe also that's why I sort of thought of this idea of building an ancillary support team, who would have more time or more whatever. Who's going to pay for all this? So that's why it really has to do with the structural constraints. And, what are the needs that can be met? What are the ideals? I love closing on your comment because I certainly agree with you very strongly. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Should I delete? Maybe I should delete my second. Yeah.
Send yourself to recycling.
Yeah.
And if you don't, as you do, plans is 6 o'clock. You really want to. No. That's what we said. Yeah. Don't do this. I feel like I'm not going to waste this time saying we can have a time. I don't know if they'll take it.
He's
Personally.
even if she would say,
Absolutely.
Do they have